Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Well, today's a big and very important episode. Well, they're actually all important, so I want to get right down to it. My guest today is Professor Fred Provenza. Now, he is currently Professor Emeritus of Behavioral Ecology at Utah State University. For the last 30 years, Fred and his research group has produced groundbreaking research that has laid the foundations for what is now known as behaviour-based management of landscapes. You don't have to be out on the land. Your landscape goes on in your own house, so listen up. That work has inspired researchers in many diverse disciplines, including ecology, human and animal nutrition and biopsychology, animal welfare, landscape restoration, sociology, eco-development, and much, much more. Together with colleagues and graduate students, he has been an author or co-author of 250 publications in peer-reviewed journals and books, and he has been an invited speaker at over 325 international meetings. When I spoke to him, he was in Montana, USA, and I was in Sydney, Australia, so I know that doesn't constitute an international meeting, but we certainly enjoyed talking to each other. He has recently released a fabulous book called Nourishment: What Animals Can Teach Us About Rediscovering Our Nutritional Wisdom. And it turns out they are much smarter than we give them credit for, and we do, in fact, have much to learn. Incidentally, as you will hear, plants are also pretty smart too. I'll let Fred explain. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Professor Fred Provenza. Welcome to the show, Fred.
Thank you very much, Ron. Wonderful to be here with you.
Now, Fred, we are going to be talking about this wonderful, wonderful book you've written called Nourishment. But before we jumped in, I wondered if you might share with our listener a little bit about your journey, which has brought you to this point, professionally, personally.
Happy to do that. I think for me, it starts as a young fellow with just an absolute fascination with nature and natural kinds of things, especially back in those days, wild animals, anything that moved, whether it was an insect or a bird or a mammal, I was just fascinated with those kinds of things. So I often tell people, for me growing up, there were only 3 seasons: hunting, fishing, which we do here in the U.S., and then skiing. Those were the 3 seasons for me. It was a natural then to go, when I went to college, to enroll in wildlife biology, where I was able to learn so many things about ecology, learn about plants, how they work, learn about animals. It was just amazing. At the same time, I was working on a ranch in Colorado, in the central part of the state, in the heart of the mountains there. And just absolutely loving learning about that part of things, working with sheep, with cattle, with goats, irrigating crops, harvesting. It was wonderful. And the two things really came together for me. When I finished school at Colorado State University, I really didn't know what to do next, though. I knew I wasn't going to be a wildlife biologist. I don't know why. I just knew. And the ranch I was working on, the old fellow that I talk about in the book, Henry DeLuca, and his wife Rose, who became like parents to my wife and I, actually, they encouraged us to just come there. They needed someone to manage, to run the ranch year round. So I did that for 2 years and just took a little time to ponder. And I don't know why, but I just thought research would be interesting. So I started looking into graduate school, ended up at Utah State University, realized that I absolutely loved doing research and learning about plants and animals and the relationships between those. And, 50 years later, here we are, and I've written this book that's kind of reflecting on that journey.
Well, it's as I said, when I think before we came on, I said I got to read your book, and I knew we were going to have this conversation. And as I was reading it, I jotted down some questions, and I thought to myself, how cool is this? The author is going to actually answer these questions. I hope you do anyway. But listen, one of the things I wanted to start, because you talked about plants and animals and that whole connection with the earth, which obviously you were attracted to, because we've been, as a species, we've been connected with the earth for a very long time. But in the last 50 years or so, that's really changed for us. How has that change, do you think, affected us as a species and also the planet?
I think that, and I'll speak to my experience here in the U.S. I think that certainly relates to some of what you've experienced in Australia, but I think that we've really fundamentally broken our linkages with the landscapes that we inhabit and that ultimately nurture us. And I think, and this gets very personal, so I don't mean to be trying to talk like this is for everyone, but I think when we break those linkages with landscapes, we ultimately end up harming ourselves both physically and spiritually. I think we're so deeply connected after the eons that we've evolved on this planet. And I think that's being manifest here in this country in many different ways that lead to poor health, both physically, the crises that we face now on obesity, diabetes, diet-related diseases.
Mental health.
Physically in terms of the planet and the health of the planet. I think the things that I see people do that really, to me, make me think we've just broken those linkages with what a sacred place this planet is and how critical it is to nurture it if we want to nurture ourselves. And I think in all of that comes the spiritual part of things, for at least for me personally as well, those deep feelings that I tried to express in different places in the book of just how sacred it all is, but nurturing relationships with one another and with the environments that we inhabit.
Yes, because one of the things that you raise in the book is our ability to identify and choose nourishing foods. That seems to have been hijacked in a way, doesn't it?
Absolutely has been hijacked. And I often think, it happens gradually, as you say, over the last 50 or even we could say 100 years here in the United States, but certainly in the last 50 to 70 years. And so as we go from generation to generation within those times, I think we don't even realize then what's been lost. And so it really takes some kind of awakening and transformation to think about, what has happened, how have our food preferences, food selection, our relationship with landscapes, how have all of those things been hijacked? And then if we think that matters, then what are some things that we can do personally to try to reconnect with the landscapes we inhabit? And the foods we ingest are really a great way to do that.
Well, in your book, you mentioned this study done in 1939. I think it was called Clara's Kids. And I thought that was really amazing. Could you share that with our listener and tell us some of the lessons that were learnt from it?
I'm happy to do that, Ron. It is an amazing story, and I'm going to give you some background that I know from reading some of the notes that you sent me you're interested in as well. We were doing studies several years ago on the importance of choice and ability to choose for animals. And we'd studied that on extensive landscapes where animals can have up to maybe even 500 different species to select from. And we were realizing how important that is because those landscapes become nutrition centers and pharmacies, both things for animals. And so I spent a career studying how does that work. Well, we were doing work with an animal nutritionist, And in animal science and animal nutrition, they've spent many, many years trying to understand and done a wonderful job of trying to understand how needs for nutrients like energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, and putting all that together. And one of the reasons they did that was to try to produce animals and animal, meat for people in the U.S. and across the globe. Well, the way that we went here in the U.S. Was originally animals were finished on pastures, and that's a totally different system from where we evolved after World War II, which is the feedlot system. So animals are born and raised on these extensive pastures and rangelands, but during the last few months of their life, they go into feedlots. And they're fed what's referred to as total mixed rations. And what those are rations that are formulated from different ingredients. For instance, corn, barley, corn silage, alfalfa, ingredients like that are mixed in proportions that meet animals' needs. And then those ingredients are ground up and mixed so that the animals really have very little ability to self-select from that. And it's formulated for the, quote, average individual. Well, we had done so much work by then that showed there is no such thing as an average individual. Every individual is so different in terms of how it's built and how it functions. And so in terms of how it behaves and in terms of what it needs to meet its needs, each one is unique. You might think from a human standpoint, each one of us is so different we can be identified by our fingerprint. A bloodhound can track us by our odors. So the question we were asking was simply, what happens if we allow animals to have a choice of the ingredients that go into the total mixed ration, or compare that with animals that are fed the total mixed ration? And it was amazing what we found. When we offered animals a choice, they actually ended up eating less food than the animals that were fed the total mixed ration. Why? Because animals in that total mixed ration were over-ingesting in order to meet needs for certain nutrients that were in that food. We could make the argument, for instance, that they were over-ingesting energy to meet needs for protein. Regardless, it cost more money to finish the animals on the total mixed ration than when animals were given a choice, because each individual was allowed to select better choice to select what it needed to meet its needs. So animals ate less. The other thing that was interesting was no animal ever selected the same diet from day to day. It varied like crazy what they would eat, and no two individuals ever selected the same ration. So we published that research, and this leads to Clara. You may wonder.
No. I think this. I'm making notes, Fred. I'm with you still. Go on.
But this leads to Clara. So there's an author in Canada who was aware of our research because he was working on books that related to our research. And in fact, in one of his books, The Dorito Effect, Mark Shaxter features the work that we did. So Mark sent me a note and he said, "Are you aware of this research by Clara Davis?" I said, "No, never heard of it." He said, "I've got to send you some papers." So he sent these papers. And I was reading what Clara did, and what really struck me first off is like, she did those nearly 100 years ago, and it's like we plagiarized what she was saying. Some of the text in there was just exactly what we had written about the cattle on the given a choice. No two individuals ever selected the same diet. No individual ever selected the same food from day to day. That's what she's writing. So what's the essence of Clara's studies? I don't know what gave her. I would love to have met her and visited with her. I don't know how she got started on this idea of the wisdom of the body, or to run a study that would reveal so much about that. But however that happened, she had the opportunity to work with people in an orphanage where children were being given up for adoption at birth. And what she did was to work with, I think it was 15 children over a 6-year period. 6 years. This is stunning to think about. And throughout that 6-year period, she offered those children 34 foods that could be procured at the local markets, wholesome kinds of foods that could be procured throughout the year. And she simply allowed those children to select free choice whatever they wanted. I want to point out there were pediatricians that were working with the study that wrote reports on it, and they said they never seen a healthier bunch of children. And so over this 6-year period, they ran the study and documented what these children were doing, and as I say, concluded really that not to be a broken record, no two children ever selected the same diet, no child ever selected the same food from day to day, but they all selected foods that met their needs. It was interesting, too, that when some of the children came in, for instance, they might have been deficient in certain nutrients, and she noted that they would select things that would help them to rectify those deficits. For instance, rickets was an issue back in those days, and they would select foods that would help them to quickly rectify those deficits. And once they had done that, they would no longer focus quite so much on that particular food. It became more a part of the diet. And that's certainly what we've seen when we've worked with mineral deficiencies in livestock, creating those mild deficiencies, and then looking at how does selection of the cattle, sheep, and goats that we were studying change. I think one of the things, Ron, that strikes me, so nourishment is the subtitle is what humans can learn from these other animals, something to that effect. And on the surface, a person might think, well, what can I learn from a goat? What's a goat got to teach me about how to select a diet? And on the surface, that's absolutely right. But I think what we did as a research group, and I'm giving credit to many, many people that I worked with, 50 or more grad students and postdoctoral students and collaborators over the years. But what we did was to move away from talking about what are animals eating and where are they going in the environment to really trying to ask the question, why are they doing that? Why, not what? And when you start asking the why questions, then you see a commonality that emerges, whether you're talking about an insect that's self-medicating to heal itself or a goat or a human being. The why is what really took us to the commonality that I think enables a person like me to write a book like Nourishment that talks about what animals can teach us about rediscovering our nutritional wisdom.
Yeah, no, I've got that cover right in front of me as you mention it. But this is what you mentioned, this notion that what makes humans unique is our ability to medicate ourselves, to make medications for various illnesses. But as you mentioned, it turns out we're not as unique as we think. And I think you've mentioned that animals, these 500 different species that are out on the pasture, it's a nutritional centre, but it's also a pharmacy. Can you explain that a little more, how an animal will make choices that are actually designed to medicate itself?
Happy to. And again, there's a really interesting, I think, historical context for this when I think back over my career, at least. And then when I think of the human part of it, and, this notion that you mentioned that the father of medicine, there's a quote by the father of medicine that's one of the things that makes humans unique, our ability to self-medicate. And it's not to detract from all the wonderful work that he did over the years, actually, but it's to show that, our knowledge of this is just broadening out. But years ago, when we and others were initiating some of the research that we were doing on extensive landscapes, we were all really interested in trying to describe the, quote, botanical and chemical compositions of the diets of species X foraging on landscape Y at time Z, as you would say, you know. And so there were tons of studies like that, and we would realize that, you know, maybe 3 to 5 species make up the bulk of the diet for animals at any point in time. But then there's another 50, 60, 70, 80 species that are in the diets, and we never made much of that, I don't think. We saw them as, you know, a part of the diet, but I don't think we appreciated what that probably meant for animals. And, you know, you can think of 2 ways to self-medicate, and one is prophylactically, the other is therapeutically. And I often think now, and I was talking with a rancher here who just does phenomenal work on landscapes. I was talking with him last week. We had a 2-hour visit, and he was saying they shepherd their cattle across these landscapes, nurturing them day to day. And he says, we've got 500 species up here. He said, I was giving a talk to ranchers in Lewiston, Idaho, 200 of them, and they were questioning me after my presentation because it was kind of a challenge to them, a lot of what I talked about. And they were saying, well, how do you medicate animals up on these extensive landscapes? And he said, I can tell you honestly, I've never had to medicate an animal. He says, the pharmacy is right out there, and they're eating this diverse array of these plants is keeping them healthy. And they say, well, what about mineral supplements? He says, I don't need to supplement with minerals. Again, they're exposed to this diverse array of plants, and so they're getting those minerals. So I see that kind of a landscape where you have this tremendous diversity of plants, as opposed, for instance, a monoculture or a pasture that has a handful of plants, or a feedlot, in my mind even worse, where there's basically no choice. These landscapes that have this diverse array of these beautiful different grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees literally are nutrition centers and pharmacies, and they enable animals to self-medicate prophylactically. But we also know that if animals are sick, if they have high loads of internal parasites, for instance, which has been really studied extensively, they will seek out plants, for instance, plants that are high in tannins, or combinations of plants that are high in compounds called terpenes, tannins and terpenes that occur in plants. They'll seek those plants out specifically, and they self-medicate on those plants. I find it really interesting, too, some of the research I quoted in that chapter on self-medication and nourishment, that if we give antiemetics to animals, then they'll no longer select those plants to the degree that they will when they need them to self-medicate. So this ability to self-medicate has been demonstrated now in everything from insects, and some of the studies with insects are just absolutely fascinating to me to read, how they'll switch their selection, and at the level of the central nervous system, their liking for plants that have the medicines they need goes up. They've been able to demonstrate these hedonic shifts, these increases in liking as a function of need for particular medicine. So everything from insects to our work with domestic animals and other peoples as well, to huge amount of work by my friend and colleague Mike Huffman on the primates. He's a world leader. He's just in demand around the globe all the time to talk about the amazing studies he's been done on self-medication. One of the things we were able to do that it's harder to do for people like Mike, for instance, that are studying primates under free-ranging conditions, we were able to show through a series of studies that we did and we did them with sheep, that sheep will learn to select the medicine they need to rectify a particular malady. So without going into details, so I'm happy to do that, we set up 3 different kinds of maladies in sheep. And then we knew that 3 different kinds of medicines would rectify those maladies, the 3 different things. And we were able to show that when sheep were experience a certain kind of malady and given a choice of the different medicines, they selected the medicine they needed to rectify the specific malady. No different from what we humans learn to do as well.
Yeah, well, which Clara's kids instinctively did, given the choice.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. An important thing that Clara pointed out too was that they didn't just know automatically what of those different choices, but they would really sample. They'd sample a lot. And we found that with animals, when they get into a state that they're lacking a particular nutrient or they're in a particular state of malaise where they need something, if they don't already know that, they start to sample broadly. And when they discover something that rectifies the situation, then they learn a preference for that, and that preference becomes really state specific. So when they experience a particular kind of internal state, then they know what to do with that. And that's Clara made an important point of that as she went along in that they really sampled a lot early on, and if they were in need, and then the body would quickly hone in on what they need. Which leads, let me say some things here. As far as nutritional wisdom goes, and we've really talked about what I consider the three legs of the stool, Ron, but let's make them really explicit right here.
Yeah, good.
With domestic animals, it's fair to say that people who study food selection, nutrition, and health of those, until the research we did over 40 years, people didn't believe that domestic animals had nutritional wisdom. There was a sense that wild animals had it. They must have it. How else could they survive? Although some people said, well, if you have a broad enough array of things, just by chance alone, you'll be able to do it. I think that's not a good statement, because you can get poisoned really easy just by chance alone, actually, on these diverse landscapes. But with the domestic animals, there had been some trials run, and for reasons we don't need to get into in our discussion, sheep and cattle didn't select what people thought, and so this idea that domestic animals had nutritional wisdom went by the wayside. I think it's fair to say nowadays, too, with human beings, that, given the crisis of obesity, diabetes, all the diet-related kind of diseases, human people who study human food selection, nutrition, and health don't tend to think that very much of this notion of nutritional wisdom. And so I really tried in nourishment to develop the ideas of how nutritional wisdom functions. And I don't say this in the book, but I see it as three legs to a stool. And if you break any one of those legs, the nutritional wisdom won't be manifest. And really, with human beings and with the animals in our care, I think we've broken all three of those legs. So one that and you're really nicely alluding to that when you're talking about Claire's kids figuring this stuff out, is what we refer to as these flavor feedback relationships. And the essence of that, when we first started, and again, I won't go clear back on this, but when we first started to realize that what's happening at the level of cells and organ systems, including the microbiome, is influencing liking for the flavor of food and food selection, it really twisted my mind in a big way, that you could offer an animal something that wasn't nutritious at all, for instance, straw, but immediately after they ate that, infuse something into their bloodstream or drench them with something that goes directly into the gut, and that is going to radically change their selection on the next day. Really twisted my mind. It was just stunning to think that was happening. But over and over again in some of those earlier days, we were being hit over the head with that. And so we systematically studied that then with energy, with protein, with ratios of energy to protein, with minerals. Folks in Australia have gone on to look at vitamins, and simply what the basic idea is that cells and organ systems, including the microbiome, are sending messages to the palate, and they can do that through hormones, neurotransmitters, peptides. I just read a great article in Science that's pursuing this kind of stuff at a really basic molecular level. But they're sending signals to the palate to alter liking for different foods in the environment as a function of need. If you think of a cell, and I think of this and talk about it in the book, a cell can only forage by what's in the capillaries. And so what's coming through those capillaries is what the cell is able to actually then select, cells foraging in that sense at that level. And what we realized is that those cells and organ systems are, through feedback, altering what's in those capillaries. This is kind of a simple way to say that.
Yeah. Well, you use a term, the word psychobiology, which I must admit I wasn't all that familiar with. Is this part of that, or can you explain?
Absolutely. Yeah. The term would be really, in my mind, how form, morphology, function, physiology, needs, the kind of things that we're talking about, alter behavior. How the relationship between those kind of things, the psycho part, and then the biology, the linkages in that sense with the landscape. Mm-hmm. So very much, it's those kinds of things, and that becomes then one really, really important leg to the stool. And it is safe to say, before the research that we did on goat, sheep, and cattle, there really wasn't a sense of that, and we had to be hit over the head with it initially to start to think about that. And then we just did so many studies over the years that over and over again just showed that feedback from these nutrients. And then we started on the secondary compounds, like we were talking about, the alkaloids, the terpenes, the phenolics, tens of thousands of compounds that plants produce and their roles, not only in self-medicating, but more generally in health. So we really studied that a lot. And the further along we went, the more complex we came to realize it is, because it's not just energy or protein or minerals or vitamins or these alkaloids and phenolics and terpenes. It's the interrelationships among those things that the body's integrating. And all that's a part then of these flavor feedback relationships. I used to be so intent on trying to learn, and we were working with natural products chemists at the University of Alaska who were hugely helpful, and trying to learn all these jillions and jillions of compounds. And I don't worry about them so much anymore, of trying to know everyone and what we think we know about them. I've just come to a point where I so appreciate that there's, strawberry, for instance, produces 5,000 volatile compounds, just 5,000 volatiles. That's, it gives you just a hint of the numbers of these compounds that plants are producing. And, you can take garlic, oregano, any of the herbs and spices, or any of these plants that people try to look at in depth, and you just see page after page of these secondary compounds. So I just have come to the point where I appreciate that there's this incredible complexity, and through these flavor feedback relationships, the body is able to figure all of this out really at a subconscious level. It's not anything that we sit and think about. I often ask people when I'm giving talks, how many of you are thinking about which enzymes to release to digest the food that you just ate? And they all laugh, and occasionally one or two will raise their hand, but obviously we don't do that. All this is happening at a subconscious level. and gently guiding us in terms of our selection. So that's one leg to the stool, these flavor feedback relationships. You led us, Ron, very nicely into the second leg of that stool, which we've talked about, and that's the availability of wholesome alternative foods. And that's certainly what Clara was doing for those children in the orphanage. She was providing them a wide array of different foods to select. And then the third part, which is really what Clara became, is the social cultural part. And Clara became the culture for those kids by providing them with wholesome alternatives. And we know from studies that we did, and then many, many studies with humans, that these experiences beginning in utero, then early in life, are just so important as transgenerational linkages to help offspring learn what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator. All these things are learned. You think about the in utero part of experience. The fetal taste system is fully functional during the last trimester of gestation. So the foods that mom is eating, the flavors of those foods are getting into the amniotic fluid and starting to prepare the young offspring for what's food when it gets into the environment. Beyond that too, and we did studies with this showing, and wonderful studies by your compatriots there in Western Australia showing the same things, that these experiences in utero also alter form and function. So how an animal's built, how their body function is really being influenced by these experiences as well. So for instance, we were showing that an animal who's eating poorer quality kinds of roughages, as they do during the winter time here when they're pregnant on landscapes, they're not only preparing their offspring to like the flavors of those foods, but they're preparing them to be better able to digest those forages. So digestible dry matter intake, as we would say in the nutrition jargon, is enhanced for an animal that's been exposed in utero to particular kinds of foods that it will need to survive during the harsher winter periods on our landscapes than an animal that's never seen those. Studies in Western Australia where saltbrush is an important part of the landscapes, Dean Ravel and colleagues showed in a really nice series of studies with some of their graduate students that experiences in utero enhance the ability of animals to utilize saltbrush. They actually drink less water. You would think they would drink more, but they drink less water as a result of these experiences in utero. Kidney form and function has been changed. And so what come to appreciate is these experiences in utero and early in life are really changing animals at all levels of these organ systems, including the central nervous system, where people have looked at how neurons get wired together at that central nervous system level. So throughout the bodies are becoming kind of locally adapted, going back to our earliest part of this stuff, to the landscapes that animals are going to be challenged to thrive in.
I think so. This is what I also loved about the book, the way it was kind of backwards and forwards between animals and humans. It was so clear that we had so much to learn from that and realised we'd lost so much. And interesting to hear you mention strawberries with 5,000 volatile compounds, because, we always hear you've got to have your fruit and vegetables. You've got to have your vegetables and fruits. Let's put them in that order. Vegetables and fruits, because they're so much better for you. And there might be a strawberry extract supplement, but I'm almost certain it doesn't have 5,000 volatile compounds in it. Supplements have become really popular in our modern world, but taking them comes at quite a price. Why might supplements not be quite as simple as they seem?
Two things come to mind right off when you ask that question, Ron, and I really appreciate where you're going and what you're thinking about that. One thing that comes to my mind, relative to supplements. And you really alluded to that perfectly with the strawberry. For instance, you can, as you well know, and the listeners as well, you can buy any of a number of supplements, from omega-3s, which are so popular nowadays, to things like herbs, garlic and onion. Over here you can buy odorless garlic supplements, and I often tease people and say, what good can that possibly be if you can't breathe on somebody and knock them over after you've had a garlic? Huh?
It's part of the therapeutic value of it, isn't it?
Right. And the point I'm going at, this first one, is that, there's no way in virtually all of these cases to include the hundreds, if not possibly thousands, of compounds that are in, for instance, garlic that you would grow in your garden, or that you might buy from a nice herb store. And what strikes me is that it's the synergies amongst all those compounds that are really where the action are. And one of the review papers I read, that was written by two co-authors in Australia, I think it's a fabulous paper. But the title of it is something like "Food, Not Nutrient, is the Basic Unit in Nutrition." And the whole point of that paper is that it's the synergies that occur amongst all the diverse arrays of wholesome foods that we eat, not the individual compounds that are in those, but yet we focus on that, and people make, becomes millions, if not $billion industries of taking these supplements that are really quite simple relative to the complexity that we're talking about when you eat diverse arrays of fruits and vegetables, herbs and spices, and so forth. That's really illustrated, I think, with omega-3s. I recently wrote a paper that was a review that in part talked about omega-3s, and originally it gives some history of how we got on the bandwagon of omega-3 fatty acids, and then some of the initial research that seemed to suggest that omega-3s had some health benefits in a supplemental form. Now, we know omega-3s and omega-6s are essential fatty acids, so that's not the issue. It's this supplemental part that we're addressing here. But, in reviewing all the literature nowadays, there's just, I hate to say no, but it's basically, that's what it comes out of, all the analyses. There's no evidence for all these alleged benefits for taking supplemental omega-3 fatty acids. The more you go, or DHA and EPA, which is even more micro, kind of focusing in on that. As you go though from the omega-3s to eating oily fish, which is now what I see the researchers who study this recommending. They're highlighting that it's the synergies amongst all these different things that are going to be, all these different compounds that are going to be in the oily fish. That's where the action is. And that's where you just, as I was alluding to earlier, you move away from this single nutrient kind of focus to the idea that it's about synergies and eating wholesome foods, and simply allowing the body, if you're eating these wholesome foods, exposing, as Claire did her children, body to this array of wholesome foods, and just letting the body guide you meal to meal and day to day, and don't worry about all the specifics of how any one compound's acting, because we probably will never get our heads around all of that.
It's interesting, because in all of the podcasts I've done, and it doesn't matter whether I've been talking about agriculture, regenerative agriculture, farming, soil, if it's the soil microbiome, if it's an oral microbiome, if it's a gut microbiome, a word that keeps cropping up as being so totally important is the word diversity.
Yes.
I mean, the more diverse, and here we are talking about it nutritionally, you're saying, well, you could take a supplement, but hey, you might get 1, 2, 5, 10 compounds in there, but you could eat the food and get 5,000. So there's a diversity there. You're talking about a paddock that offers an animal 500 different species and allowing them to self-medicate. And diversity. It's a really important word, isn't it? Concept.
Honest to goodness, it is. You know, when I think back, I mentioned, you asked me where my interest started, and I explained some of that. And I think back to when I was a young undergraduate, 50-some years ago, going to school at Colorado State University. Ecology actually was a fairly young discipline back in those days. But, even then, they were talking about diversity, the importance of diversity. And I got the words. I understood what they were saying. But I have to say, after a lifetime of working with that, it's just like, boy, they really were just on target with that. So that has not gone away. That notion of the importance of diversity in ecological systems, diversity. I often think of it in terms of plants, because I think plants are so much the glue that binds everything together. And of course now, there's a huge interest in soil, rightfully so, and all the life that's in soil, moving away from just the physical chemistry of soil to the life, and that's where the action is. And I certainly appreciate that. And appreciate the notion that there's herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores below ground, actually, that are all munching on one another and facilitating relationships of plants with the mineral soils and so forth. But so there's that tremendous diversity within soils. But I think so much of plant diversity, and plants really is the glue that, without plants, there's nothing below ground. Without plants, there's nothing above ground. I see them as just amazing. I'll never forget going back to the Colorado State University days. My mother had always grown gardens, and she loved plants. She loved horticultural plants. So our yard had lots of them. So I was exposed to plants, but I have to say I never really had seen a plant until that spring semester when I took a class in plant identification, and we had to go out and collect 50 plants and mount them on herbarium sheets. We had to learn how to use these these horrible dichotomous keys that are just, these monstrous books, and we had to read an entire book just to learn the terms that are in these monstrous dichotomous keys. But I tell you, going out there and picking those, identifying those plants just about brings tears to my eyes, even to this day, because it's like I really got introduced to plants. And these little plants that come up in the spring of the year, some of the pasque flowers here, just absolutely stunningly beautiful plants. And,
Fred,
the diversity is it's amazing.
You mentioned, we have this notion about intelligence, and I think part of your book, I think our listener is kind of getting a sense that animals actually do have an innate intelligence, and we could argue about the innate intelligence of humans. I think it's there; it's just been suppressed. But you also mention about the innate intelligence of a plant. You point out that in fact they're very intelligent. Can you explain that to our listener?
Yes, and years ago there were books that I remember, one in particular that was published on the wisdom of plants, and so it was amazing. It was stunning to read that book, but I think at the time it was a little ahead of its time, and a lot of the scientists really poo-pooed the book, basically. But in the time since that book came out, which was maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, I can't remember. It's an old book, The Secret Lives of Plants. But there's been so much research done right up to books like I talk about in Nourishment, this one titled Plant Intelligence, and the rigor that's gone into the research that underlies a book like that is stunning. It's just top-notch kind of science at the most basic levels. And it's simply revealing that plants are conscious. They interact with the environment in stunning kinds of ways. What deceives us is they don't get up and walk around, and we don't see, for instance, like we might see our pet cat or dog engaging in behaviors that we can really relate to more. Well, plants do move. They track the sun, heliotropism. Down below ground, it's stunning to see the way roots interact with that environment. Roots forage. They'll seek out water, of course. They'll track water in the environment. They'll seek out nutrients they need. And so they're very actively foraging below ground, much as we would above ground. Plants can communicate with one another. That's one of the things that really came clear during my career by research that some of the plant ecologists did. They were so we mentioned the strawberries and the 5,000 volatile compounds. That's a key way that plants communicate with one another and with organisms in the environment. So they'll produce these compounds. They're volatile, so they'll be, through the stomates, they'll be released, and they get out into the environment, and they can alert plants. For instance, if a plant is being eaten by a caterpillar or a goat or whatever it is, the plant that's having that happen to it will release these volatile compounds. That'll be a cue to the plants around it. Hey, better kick up the concentrations of these compounds that deter animals from eating us. And so you'll see a rise in those concentrations of compounds. At the same time, too, studies with caterpillars show that so they release these compounds, and predatory insects that are predators on the caterpillars will have learned that, hey, when the plant releases these compounds, that means there's food on that plant, so they'll come and attack the caterpillar. So there's amazing kind of relationships that plants have with the environment that we simply didn't realize in the past. Yeah. And I mentioned in the book plants were the first biochemists. I originally had a whole chapter on plants. I reduced it to not too much in the book now, enough to give this flavor, but there was an entire chapter, and of course, as we're saying, people are writing entire books on this, but this whole business of plants and plant intelligence. And in the book, I talk about plants as the first biochemists. It's just stunning to, for any students who have taken biochemistry, any people who have taken that, you realize there's an incredible level of what goes on in organic chemistry and all. For some people, it's mind-boggling to the point where they actually they can't think that way. They don't like biochemistry at all. And but for certain, it's an amazing field of inquiry, and people who are biochemists we tend to hold in high esteem. And the things that biochemists have done are amazing. But then one realizes plants were probably, like I say in the book, the first biochemists. Mm-hmm. They're doing that all the time. So then it raises the question, well, what are we to think of that when it comes to plants? Do we just think of them as a machine? And I try to argue in the book, no, it's really not. They're, back in the day, and I'll go back a little bit, I think it's irrelevant now. When biochemists were first studying plants, biochemists and physiologists, they were focusing on nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium from a mineral standpoint, and of course photosynthesis and these processes. But they realized there was this tremendous number of other kinds of compounds it was so interesting to me to realize that they originally referred to them as waste products. And I used to think, well, okay, that makes sense. Maybe it's kind of the feces, what's left after plants do their primary metabolism with protein, energy, all that kind of stuff. Well, that changed. And at the time I was a young pup in the field, the ecologists were referring to them as secondary compounds. In other words, we had all these primary compounds that we understood their roles, and then there were these others so-called secondary. But what we've come to realize in the last 50 years is they're not secondary at all. They're fundamentally important for plants as they mediate interactions with the external environment. And they're adjusting concentrations of these compounds as a function day to day of their interactions with other plants, with animals, with temperature, with everything that goes on in the environment. These secondary compounds are playing really, really important roles. And so that's a whole amazing area.
And colours too? Are colours what gives plants colours, the secondary compounds as well, or is that a whole other area?
Right, that's right. All of these secondary compounds give this vast array of different colors that that occur. Of course, green we know is a common one, but then all these other reds, oranges, salmons that occur in leaves that reveal different classes of compounds that are functioning, and then the things that we are the showy flowers that just are stunning in their different colors and serve as ways to attract insects and so forth.
Gee, I tell you what, this whole idea of not eating, a lot of people are vegan and vegetarian because they feel you shouldn't be eating an intelligent animal, and I've just kind of started to throw up this whole new ethical question. How do I justify myself ethically by eating an intelligent plant who communicates and forages and sends out signals to other animals and I will eat my vegetables. I will eat my vegetables, but I'm just saying that there is a much bigger ethical issue here than let's not kill animals.
Honestly, Ron, and I so appreciate you saying that. I think it really raises, and it goes back to a question you asked really at the beginning, our relationship with environments. I think there's a real interesting irony to be pondered in that notion that really life lives on life. Life can't exist without living on other life in a very real sense. And plants, of course, are the kind of the givers of that below ground and above ground. But then what it brings into me is that whatever way a person chooses to forage, to realize that it's all sacred. It's all sacred, whether you're foraging on a plant or an animal or whatever you choose or combinations of those. I think that's that part to me where it takes you back to it's all sacred. And, I used to think that so much in the years that my wife Sue and I always loved to we were peas in a pod related to loving the outdoors, to loving to fish and to hunt, which is really our foraging activities. We love to grow gardens. And now here where we are in Ennis, we have vegetable, herbal, medicinal gardens. I think that's a really nice thing when we either grow or procure our own food in one way or another, especially if it's out of this notion that you're making me think about relative to the sentience and consciousness and that it's all life and it's all sacred in our relationship. Only by nurturing the environments that nurture us, I think, are we going to really be able to continue to exist on this planet. And so I see that. And I think, we were talking about, before we got on air, about Charlie Massey's book, The Call of the Reed Warbler.
Beautiful book. Beautiful.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, the Aboriginal peoples here in the U.S., and before all of the modern technology and what fossil fuels and all of that enabled, people really did, I think, have very intimate relationships with landscapes, and I think they saw it all as sacred in that sense of, that's what's nurturing us ultimately.
Now, Fred, we've got a very anthropocentric, people-centered view of the world. Anyway. But tell me, are you an optimist? Do you reflect on how we're going at this point in time, and do you feel optimistic?
I've always been an optimist. I've never been a fear-mongerer. It's not in my nature. And so I am. I do see reasons for optimism. Saying that, though, I think, too, that there's reasons for us to really be paying attention. I think, I think back to people like in our country, there are people who wrote really profound, interesting things about what we're talking about back in the day. One of them that all of us in natural resources get exposed to is a fellow named Aldo Leopold, and he wrote this Sand County Almanac probably 75 years ago. He was writing about these things. I've read that several times. It's just beautiful stories of his knowledge and intimate relationship. It's amazing. But I often think, here he was concerned back in the 40s about writing in such beautiful prose about what was happening. And I think, my goodness, if he thought it was bad then, in the sense of the human footprint on this landscape, he hadn't seen anything. And so now we're in the Anthropocene.
That's it.
And I often think the Anthropocene and some of its symptoms from species extinctions, and if not outright extinctions, the massive influences we're having on populations of everything from the insect world to the fish world to the coral reefs to herbivore populations, there's no denying that we are massively influencing their numbers. And then we think of things like changing climates and the degree to which humans are influencing that. And so I think we really, really need to be doing everything we can as individuals to try to not have our each footprint be a littler footprint. Sue and I sure tried to think about that here and what are things that we can do. And I'm not trying to say like we're some great saints at this, you just realize that by being on the planet, you are participating in all this stuff. But then there are things that one can think about of how to try to reduce the footprint. And we were talking about an article related to the role that agriculture, and in that sense, each of us can be little agriculturalists. I mentioned that Sue and I love to grow our own herbal, vegetable, and medicinal gardens. And we don't have a large property here. In state terms, it's an acre and a half. But we've really worked to revegetate it, to let the native plant species that grow here, to encourage them and the diversity that's here, and to have a smaller lawn, because we see that as places where, you can put a lot of water and fossil fuel and pesticides if you want. We don't, but, to try to encourage the native plants, we've planted tons of probably 150 different species of trees and native shrubs that produce berries and, little, and again, I'm not trying to sound like we're, I'm just trying to say there's things that each of us can do at a really local level in terms of, and how much energy we use. But then agriculture as a group, and there's this huge report that's just come out, and the Eat Lancet report,
yes,
and many
yes.
that are certainly drawing attention and arguing that, there's a huge relationship between the foods we eat, human health, and environmental health. And that is so true. Then one can think about, what role does agriculture play? And we know that agriculture has a fair-sized footprint. And so a lot of times agriculture and raising of beef, for instance, really gets negative press. But what one can realize is that domestic animals, when managed in really good ways, like Charlie Massey talks about throughout the Call of the Reed Warbler, with example after example after example, they can be, when you put them together as a group, civil pasture, grazing management, intercropping, and on and on. Those are the top way that we can reduce greenhouse gas, not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but sequester greenhouse gases. So, and that's a hope, because it's things that we can do. If just to fearmonger or to be pessimistic doesn't do much. But if you think, okay, here's to the best of our knowledge, which is always limited, I think. Here's to the best of our knowledge, things that we've done and ways that we've broken our linkages with the landscapes that nurture us. Then we think, well, what are things that we can do? And there are things, just at the household level, right on through to agriculture. And as we like to say here, we all vote with our dollars.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Maybe at the political level, I think nobody likes politicians much. They always poll really low, down in the 20s. And I'm not bad mouthing them, but that's tough duty at that level. But we vote with our dollars, and so we can encourage the kind of behaviors that we would like in corporate America through the things that we purchase or don't purchase. And that feeds back then to these higher levels of relationships between corporate and political kind of interactions and relationships. And so I am, I am optimistic in that sense. And I think by participating, we're creating, like in that one chapter, by the things that we do. It's never a neutral thing, by participating, we're helping to create.
Now we're just coming to the end, Fred. It's been terrific. I can't believe, we've covered quite a territory here, but I just wanted you to take a step back, and to a large extent, you may have already answered this, but taking a step back from your role as a researcher and, a learner as well as a teacher, what do you think the biggest challenge is for people on their health journey through life in our modern world today?
That's an excellent question, Ron. And I want to say the time has gone really quickly, and I want to do a nod to you for the service that you're doing with the podcasts, and for the wonderful kinds of issues that you discuss on a regular basis related to that question, related to health. And it seems to me and I know you do a great job of covering all the different facets of that. It's such a diverse thing of what makes us healthy. And, the physical aspects of that, our relationships with one another and the environments that we inhabit, and then the spiritual nature of that, the notion of how sacred everything is. And I think, to me, just this notion of gratitude, as from reading the book, I tend to view this as, a visit. We're here for a visit. We barely step onto the planet and we're gone. But for me, I think, even though, you can look and say all the horrors that are here, and certainly you look and, oh my goodness, some of the things, but then there's incredible beauties and the wonders and the mysteries. And I think getting wrapped up in that, and for me, gratitude, for the chance to, however all that works, to be able to be here for the blink of an eye. I try to think of that sometimes when I get a little negative, just to be grateful for it all. And and Sue and I were living in those backwoods where I wrote the book, and I could have never written this book if we weren't living there. I couldn't have done it from the office at the university or wherever. We were just in a meditation there, basically surrounded by nature and the beauty of nature. And I got out of the quote professor mode, not interested in trying to study anything anymore, not interested in trying to, or having to teach courses basically, or whatever it was, and just got like a child again, like Nietzsche's transformations from the child into all the stages of life where you have to do all these things. And then if you get the chance to transform back into a child again, that's in just awe of the beauty and the mystery and wonder. And that really happened when we were there in those backwoods. And I used to, and soon I both, but it just struck me heaven, and as some books I was reading that I talk about in there, I used to think a lot about that. And this notion that heaven really isn't a place, it's a state. And we're in a dimension of that. I used to look around and think, oh my goodness, I just totally get that. And it was so refreshing, from a health standpoint. I think all those kind of things really contribute to overall health, physical, mental, spiritual, the whole ball of wax.
Well, Fred, that's a great note to finish on, and thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing so much of your knowledge with my guests, with my listeners. Thanks for joining us, Fred.
Ron, thank you very much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure to visit with you.
That word diversity keeps popping up. It's a recurring theme on this podcast, and it's very well worth exploring. Diversity builds resilience, and resilience is what we need in our modern world. Imagine the diversity of nutrients we haven't even discovered yet if you just ate real food. A humble strawberry with 5,000 volatile compounds. If you needed motivation for eating your vegetables and fruits, keeping the carbs low, of course, that would have to be it. Another word is ethics, and how interesting to hear how intelligent plants are, as are animals. And the more we rely on processed food and supplements, the further we move from our own nutritional wisdom, using foods prophylactically to avoid disease and therapeutically to treat it. When I read his book, so much in it resonated with me. It really is a fabulous book. It's really well worth the read. We'll have links to it in the show notes. Now, there's some really exciting stuff coming up. We have our own Unstress app. Yes, our own app. Now, I mentioned this podcast was a little self-indulgent. I've often said that, in that I really enjoy talking to people who know much more than me, and every week I get to ask them questions and they answer them. And I learn a lot when I research them, and I learn a lot when I talk to them. And it occurred to me while I was on this self-indulgent trip that there was so many clicks to find the latest episode. And people are doing so much on their phones, so maybe a simple app would be a good idea. So there it is. Download it and keep in touch. There's a lot going on. There's some free webinars, some great ebooks, and an online course, workshops, blogs, Facebook, etc., etc. So, until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should